please join me in welcoming Dr. Ann.
And thank you all for coming. This issue is so near and dear to our hearts and touches us so closely. So I'm thrilled to be able to share some of my ideas with you. I am going to share my screen now. I love this cartoon. I want to just pause so you can take a moment to take this in. This is so much about, even though I study this and think about it and talk about it and make radio about it, so often we can live in this place of like, it's impossible. There's nothing to do. And I love the way it gets put together. So this is a talk about climate courage, how we access our courage to become effective change agents with climate change, and how good that is, not only for our planet, but for our own mental health. This is a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Safe Space Radio. We're going to talk about what is the mental health impact of climate change. I'm going to focus in particular on shame and courage. And I'm going to be asking you to think about what are the things in your life that help you access your courage. So I hope some of you brought a notepad and paper. If you don't have one, I'm giving you advance notice so you can get one, because there's going to be some scribbling down ideas that I hope will be of use to you. Now we're going to talk about 3 different kinds of courage in relation to climate change: to really face it, to bear the feelings that come up, and to move from, having feelings and discussions about it, but to actually taking action steps. And at the end of my talk, we're going to break into dyads. So you're going to be partnered with someone, and there's going to be some questions that you can go through together. So I hope that part will be really pretty fun, because you can feel really alone with this subject, and it's great to connect with someone else about it. So this shame and trying to help alleviate shame is probably my life's mission. This is a statue from the garden, I think in the Louvre in Paris, and it's about shame. Shame is the feeling of being defective, weak, bad, or a failure that make me unlovable. And this is the heart of what I'm working with as a psychiatrist. Whether I'm treating someone for depression, anxiety, addiction, trauma, at the heart of it, someone with depression can struggle with feeling like, oh, I should be mind over matter. Why aren't I stronger than this? Or same thing with anxiety. People with trauma histories may feel like sort of damaged goods. People with addictions may feel like a failure or weak. At the heart of all these things that I treat, I think the heart of the suffering is this feeling of shame. I think often the feeling of shame can be even worse than the depression or worse than the anxiety. So when I first went into private practice, this was back in 2007, started thinking, we need a public health solution to this problem. I mean, this is what people are suffering from. And then I started noticing that when my patients were talking about this, just as this statue shows, they were covering their face. If I Google images of shame, this is what comes up. And what you'll see is that everybody is hiding, doesn't want to be seen. And what it does is it isolates us. We keep very silent and therefore very alone about our worst suffering. So shame is a force of hiding, avoidance, and isolation. And it leaves us again very, very alone. So in 2008, I decided, what is a public health solution to the problem of shame and stigma, which is shame coming at you from the outside? It would be radio, because the person, you saw those images of people covering their face. Radio is perfect for that. The guest isn't being witnessed. Their outfit isn't being critiqued and commented on. And so we founded it in 2008. I did, to inspire courageous conversations about subjects that are hard to talk about in order to reduce stigma, shame, and isolation, and to foster compassion and public health. And we, as Lucy said in her introduction, we've been broadcasting since 2008. Well over 300 shows now, and 10 national specials. So this gives you a sense of some of the topics. Now, this little word cloud that covers our topics was before we made our show on climate courage, which aired last May for Mental Health Awareness Month. And I invite you, this is our website, I invite you to go to safespaceradio.com. Maybe you want to just scribble that down and check us out. Because if you'd like to hear our show about climate courage, you can hear it there. So the issue of shame is related to climate, but we don't really ever talk about it, which is no surprise, right? I've just finished saying that shame is a subject we don't talk about. We talk about climate anxiety. People talk about eco-anxiety. We talk about fear, overwhelm, despair, defeatedness, anger. But I don't hear people talking about climate shame, which is that sense of moral failure and weakness that, I should have done something about this and I haven't, or, how is this all of our fault? And one example I'll give you, and this for us in Maine, I have this app on my phone that lets me calculate what sea level I'm at. And early on, when I heard about climate change, I entered, what is my sea level? And it was like, oh, phew, I'm higher than probably where the sea level rise is going to be. And then I felt relieved, but I also felt guilty, like, oh, I'm just looking out for myself. This problem is going to affect everybody in some ways. And the same thing is age. When I poll my friends and I say, when you hear dire predictions about climate change, like, oh, in 2050, we're going to see this, this, and that. How many of you have done the math to figure out, oh, in 2050, how old am I going to be? And for those of us who are old, there can be a feeling of relief, like, oh, phew, I won't be alive anymore. And that's a terrible feeling. Then we feel really guilty for having done that. And I just want to offer some compassion. I think this is very frightening. And of course, we want to do these calculations to figure out if we're going to be safe. But for those of us who are parents and grandparents, there really isn't that much relief in it. And we end up feeling, ashamed of ourselves for having thought of it that way. Another thing that I think really contributes to shame over climate change, how many of you are familiar with the term carbon footprint? And I'm just sort of looking, for those of you who have your cameras on, I see a bunch of nodding heads. Yes. So carbon footprint is sort of a calculation, about your house, how much are you contributing emissions every year yourself? And when I did this, I did an energy audit of my house and I learned about my insulation and where the leaks were. And I took it so seriously. And then I found out about a year ago that the concept of carbon footprint was invented by British Petroleum. And it was entirely strategic on their part to get people to focus on their individual behavior and not to focus on what BP doesn't want us to focus on, which is regulation of corporate practices and basically keeping it in the ground. In the long run, to be effective about climate change, we need to keep oil, gas, and coal in the ground. But as long as we're focused on sort of my individual responsibility, I'm not focused on where I need to be, which is on sort of corporate governance and government regulation. So what BP, and I have to say, whoever they hired as their strategic, consultant, I mean, it was brilliant because so many of us really well-meaning people have focused so much on trying to improve our individual houses, but this is not going to be enough. And when we keep focused on our individual sort of self-improvement, it disempowers us by keeping us separate. It makes us feel ashamed because, oh, I still have a propane furnace or something like that. And it distracts us from acting together, which is really what we need in terms of power. So when we shame people, we isolate them and we disempower them. Shame is not only a psychological force, it's a political one. So individual action, don't get me wrong, right? Individual action is still incredibly important and valuable, but mostly to the degree that it inspires people to come together and to work together. So for instance, we do know data has shown that when one person in a neighborhood puts solar panels up on their roof, it does start inspiring other people in their neighborhood to do it. So as long as individual action is highly visible, it will have a ripple effect. If we think about Greta Thunberg and her school strikes, which ultimately inspired millions of people, that is the kind of individual action that is really, really effective. But in order to be effective at doing the kinds of large scale change that we need to be doing, we need to be working together. And the wonderful news is that working together on a cause that you believe in turns out to be really good for your mental health. So the exciting news that I'm here to share is that working for climate change, to address it and working to improve all the mental health challenges turns out to be deeply aligned, and which is wonderful, wonderful news. So the concern about climate change is really rising. These are some recent national and international polls. 2019, 72% of Americans report they're very worried or worried about climate change. The American Psychiatric Association in 2020 reported that 68% of Americans fear that it's affecting our mental health. So they're not only worried about it, but they're feeling like that degree of worry is really concerning. And then just last year, the BBC reported that 75% of young people under the age of 30 from 10 different countries report that they feel the future is very frightening. And 56 of those polled fear that, quote, humanity is doomed. Well, that's terrifying, right? That's absolutely terrifying. So you know by now already about me that I like these word clouds. When I talk, these are some of the feelings that I hear about in my office as a psychiatrist. So there's not just the fear and anxiety that we hear about and the hopelessness and sense of despair and grief, but there's outrage, there's a wish to ignore it, to avoid it, feeling resigned. There's so many different feelings that we're all wrestling with. So in my office as a psychiatrist, since the new year, and I don't know how many of you are therapists, but I really noticed that with the new year, I would say climate change used to come up in my office maybe once a week, usually among parents or grandparents. It started coming up in my office now, literally almost every single day since New Year's. And part of that is because people have such a strong sense of worry about the future. And that's not, that's partly the war in Ukraine. That's the January 6th, people worried about democracy. So it's sort of I think New Year's Eve is often this sort of taking stock moment. But this is the kind of thing that I'm hearing sitting in my office as a psychiatrist, especially for older people, a sense of guilt about, well, I haven't done enough to protect my children and my grandchildren. A lot of fear about the future. Young people I talk to, so many of them talk about whether or not they should even have children. Is the future secure enough? The New York Times polled 38% of young people in childbearing age report that you need to think about climate change when deciding how many children you should have, and that they will probably have fewer children than they wish as a result. People talk about their sense of hopelessness. People talk about their anger and lack of faith in that we're really going to do what we need to do. People bring in enormous grief about extinctions and losses. Talk to people with PTSD from hurricanes and from wildfires, particularly in California. And lastly, a real sense of confusion. Like, I want to do something, but I don't have a sense of what will really make a difference. There's so much lack of clarity, and that leaves people feeling very at sea, very lost with it, which is very hard to bear. And I want to say about all of these things, these are not mental illnesses. These are normal human responses to a very unhealthy situation. So when I talk about mental health, I'm not talking about mental illness. I'm talking about suffering, human suffering. So I'm going to pivot now to talk about a person who really has inspired me and who's helped me think about this in a different way. This is Nelson Mandela on the left, as I'm sure you recognize. The person on the right is someone I had not heard of before. His name is Ibrahim Rasool, and he was imprisoned with Nelson Mandela. And I had the opportunity to interview him about his work. Under Mandela, he was the American ambassador. He's the ambassador to the United States from South Africa. And when I was interviewing him, while I'm getting up my recording equipment all set up, we're just chit-chatting. And he says, well, Anne, did you know that in South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was the process when people who had been tortured and had family members be killed and imprisoned gave their testimony, as well as the military and the apartheid government gave their testimony and their confession and their apologies. He said everyone who gave their testimony was given the opportunity to meet with a psychiatrist ahead of time. I hadn't known that. And I said, really? And he said, yes. Do you know what the role of the psychiatrist was? And I said, no, tell me, and he said that the role of the psychiatrist was to encourage. He said, we use that word encourage so casually. Encourage should have a hyphen. Encourage means to foster the courage, to invite out, to call out the courage of the people who were going to give their testimony. And I just want to say, I wrecked the rest of that interview because I started weeping. I felt like he had sort of handed me my vocation. Like I'd been waiting for someone to tell me what it was that I really want to do with my life. And that was it, to foster courage. So I'm going to share with you some of the things I've learned about that in relation to climate change. The first is, what is courage? Because people are often very confused about that. We confuse it with bravery. Courage is doing what is right in the presence of fear, despite the fact that you are afraid. It isn't the absence of fear. It is doing it anyway, even when you're scared. And often that means a willingness to get curious about your fear, to learn about it, even to befriend it, so that you can go ahead and do what you need to do, despite the fact that, yes, you're trembling in your boots. So what I want to do, and this is what I was alluding to in the beginning when I said, please get out your notepad. I'm going to take about 5 minutes. Let me just get a timepiece here to invite you to think about a time. And I'm talking small c courage. It doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't mean you went off to war, nothing like that. It's something like a time when you spoke up and said something where you felt really afraid, but you knew someone had to say it. A time when you stood up for someone who was getting bullied. A time in a meeting, maybe when you were the one who had to say the awkward thing. It might be a time when you apologized, when you could have gotten away with not apologizing. Think of a moment, take a moment to think of a time. Keep it small because I don't want you to feel bad, like, oh, I can't think of anything. Just keep it realistic. A time when you were able. All of us have times where we were not able. So just take a moment, think about what that time was. And then here's the real part of the exercise, which is actually not the story, but this part, the part below. What were the reasons, the factors that let you access your courage? What was it that in that instance, you were able to do what needed to be done? And I'm going to be quiet now, and I invite you to think about what that might be for you. And we'll come back in about 4.5 minutes. Okay. So what I'd like to do is ask you, Sophie, could you enable the chat again, please? So what I'd like to ask you to do is not to, do I need to stop the share in order to have the chat be active? No? Okay. Not to tell us the story of what you did. We don't have time for that, but make a list of a few things that helped you access your courage. And here is the list. I've now asked about 1,700 people this question at a lot of talks, and I've gathered in their answers. And I would propose to you that it comes down to 2 things. It comes down to love and clarity. And let me tell you more about what I mean. Love is friends who will celebrate. So if you were like, I did it, I went and told my boss, like, I can't stand it when you do that. And I came home and my friends were like, yay, you did it. Just knowing that your friends will celebrate you helps you take a big risk. Feeling support from your family, that they're going to love you no matter what. Feeling like someone believes in you, someone is rooting for you. Sometimes it's a deep commitment to the cause itself. Like, yes, I'm going to stick my neck out because I love this issue. It's so important to me. And often, perhaps most often, it's to protect someone you love. I stuck up for someone. I didn't want that person to be bullied. I didn't want that person to be hurt. I spoke up because we need to help. And that someone you love might even include your future self, where you speak up to your boss so that your work can become more bearable in the future. So this is what I mean by love in this column. And by clarity, what I mean is a really clear sense of your own values. Like, this is what matters to me. And the more I'm clear about that, the more I will feel like I'm going to speak up for it. Sometimes it's the example. One person, I saw someone else do it, so I can do it too. It can just take one person, just like I was saying with one person with solar panels on their roof. They help me get clear. I need to do this. Sometimes it's the alternative of not doing it was just unbearable, and getting really clear, like, what would happen if I didn't do it? Not bearable. There might be real clarity about, you know what, even if it goes badly, I'm going to survive. Even if, like, I make a complete ass of myself, I'm going to be fine. And that clarity is really helpful. And then the last form of clarity is like, well, I knew what to say. I knew what to do. It's very hard to speak up when you don't actually know what to say. So these are some of the things that I have heard. Now, I can't see the chat. I don't know how to quite do that. Is there a way for me to see the chat? How about if I stop the share for a moment? Okay, because I'd love to see if people are posting things, knowing it was the right thing to, okay, this is a specific thing, and I would regret it if I didn't speak up, knowing that I had one good friend who supported me. So please post to everyone, yes. Independent role models, there that is about examples, a supportive spouse, relief and pleasure, being able to walk the talk instead of just talking it. Fear of not doing anything, that's true, right? Seeing the external facts clearly. People who supported me, telling someone else that I would do it, right? If you commit yourself, I'm going to do this, that really helps you actually show up and do it. Knowing that someone believed me, knowing how awful I would feel if I didn't do it, feeling that I found my voice, that I would make a difference. These are beautiful. This is exactly, Sophie, by the time everyone's finished putting them in, can I ask you a favor? Would you like screenshot this or save these? Because I'd be grateful if you would. I'm not gonna be able to do that while I'm talking. But these things, we relate to them, right? Having a buddy with me, the issue mattered. I didn't take action. I did it after the fact. That's all right. Whenever we do it, trusting others and trusting who I am. These are very, very powerful things. So I invite you to keep adding them as you think of them. And what I would like to do is make sure that you remember the things that you're writing down. Because when we have to call on our courage again in the future, and we all will, these are the things that you now know inspire your courage. So like hold on to these lists because you can turn to them again. So I am going to share my screen again, come back to my notes. Okay, so what is courage? What that means, if I talk about clarity and love, it means that courage is the meeting place of truth and love. And I would propose to you that it is, and let me just make this 1 second. There we go. Now you can all see it, right? That it is the path of our greatest aliveness when we are being courageous. And the great news is courage helps with our mental health and it helps with climate change. So it is a win-win situation. And I would invite all of us to take seriously investing in the things that will help us foster our courage. And I would propose to you that courage not only helps us do what we need to do because of our own clarity, but acts of courage generate light for others. Remember I said that even one example helps you do it? Courage is contagious and it's really generous. One person being courageous helps all the people who witness it. I do want to make a distinction here between clarity versus being right. And this is a key detail with effective action around climate change. Clarity is not self-righteousness, even though this could be very seductive and very, very tempting. Clarity is truth when seen through the eyes of love. The word courage comes from the French word cœur. Cœur means heart. So I like to think of the kind of courage as a kind of heartfulness or heartedness. Because it is not a sort of self-righteous superiority. And I would argue that the more self-righteous and we are, the more self-defeating, the more it inflames the opposition to climate change work. So we need to work on our self-righteousness and distinguish it in our minds from clarity. So in therapy, I would propose that, and again, as I've said, like, what is my role as a therapist? It is to foster courage. And that may be from a mental health standpoint, to face painful truths, to bear the feelings that come up in the presence of compassion, and to do what needs to be done. That's sort of at the heart of what therapy is about. And I would propose to you that these three movements of facing reality about climate change, bearing the pain, the feelings that come up in relation to climate change, and to address it are the work of climate courage. So I'm going to walk you through those. So step one, the courage to face reality. Now, as a country, we are really doing better at facing the reality of climate change. Those number of Americans who deny it's really an issue is shrinking month by month. But the truth is, when something is this frightening, we can get very self-protected. And our self-protected mechanisms, which are often unchosen, they're sort of automatic and unconscious, they really contribute to us kind of avoiding thinking about it, really learning about it, or really facing it. So one way that I do this, and I learned this from Ogechi Obi, who's a young woman who's a climate activist here in Maine. And she said she did a sample. She did a lot of interviewing last summer on what are the barriers to people getting active. And among young people, one of the things is jargon. She's like, ocean acidification. People don't know what that is. So she said the real thing is to bring it home with concrete examples. So I thought I would give you some personal examples from my life here in Maine. So last year, for the first time, I live in an old house in Maine that, yes, has a basement that floods in the spring. And for the first time ever, I've lived here for 21 years, my basement flooded in February during a rain. That had never happened. That was very sobering. Another thing was this February, I wonder how many of you actually know someone who slipped and fell on the ice. There was so much ice in February. My husband slipped and fell, broke 4 ribs. And in the same week that he fell on the ice, 3 other friends of mine, one broke a kneecap, one hurt her back, and one just slipped and fell and hurt herself generally. With warmer temperatures, we're getting more rain, and then we're having freezing temperatures at night. And so we're having a lot more ice and a lot more injuries. 3 years ago, I brought a window AC unit from my bedroom because it's at the top of my house and I couldn't sleep. It was so hot. I'd lived for 18 summers in Maine without an AC unit. And I ran into a air conditioning installing guy at lunch once. And I said, how busy are you? Has your business ticked up? And he said, oh my gosh, air conditioning unit installation in Maine is just through the roof. This is like unbelievable curve. Last summer, as many of you know, we had the first shark attack that led to a death in Maine that would never happened. As the oceans are getting warmer, we all know the sharks have been here for a long time, but they are getting more. And then lastly, I grew up going to Scarborough Beach and finding sand dollars on the beach. And I don't find sand dollars on the beach anymore. So these are some of the very personal ways that climate change is already affecting my life. None of these are catastrophic. My husband might say that falling and breaking 4 ribs was catastrophic, but not on the large scale that we're talking about. And I invite you to bring it home, make it personal, and think about, how are you noticing climate change in your own life? Because that's highly motivating when it really becomes personal and not just theoretical. There's also, the very large scale issues like, the global refugee crisis that will ensue. So much of Bangladesh is at such a low sea level that as sea level rises, we know we're going to face an enormous refugee problem. We know there will be tremendous loss of life and species. The disaster rate is already rising. And what we know is that under threat, voters are more likely to turn to a sort of strongman, authoritarian figure when they feel scared. We know this throughout history. So there's reason to be very afraid at a global level too. So when I say face reality with courage, I really mean face it in 4 levels. One, that it's real, that it will affect all of us, no matter what sea level our house is at, that it is urgent, and that each of us as individuals does need to do something. We need each other to do something. So what helps us face it? Because those are scary things. And here we are with courage. Reconnect with the sources in your life of clarity and courage. So like, what do I believe in? What are my values? What am I clear that I really believe in? But also, what am I good at? If I'm clear about what are my gifts, what do I have to bring to the table? And also, what is there a place that I love that I want to protect? Or is it someone I love, particularly a young person? That helps us summon up our courage. Robert J. Lifton is a psychiatrist whose work I very much admire. He went into Hiroshima after World War II and interviewed survivors. He went to Auschwitz and interviewed people. He went into some really frightening places. And he told me the single thing that helped him do those kind of frightening things was to think of himself as the kind of person who does this. Oh yeah, this is what I do. I'm the kind of person who does this. And so the more we begin to think about ourselves as courageous, which is really sort of like, I don't know anyone who, if I ask them, oh, are you a courageous person? Almost everyone would say, no. And maybe that's because we're modest, and we don't want to be self-aggrandizing. But I would propose to you that the more we begin to think, I am the kind of person who does this. I am the kind of person who will stand up and speak up about this. It has this kind of ripple contagious effect, even inside our own lives. It helps us do it the next time. So this is a picture of my husband and son, because this is the motivation for me. My son he's going to grow up into a very different world. Love is more motivating than fear. So we're going to talk more about that in a moment. So step 2 was to bear the feelings that come up as you face reality. And these are some of the range. I talked about these already. Fear, anger, hopelessness, confusion, grief. These are not all of them, but these are the ones that come up the most. So I interviewed she calls herself a climate psychologist, Renee Lertzman. And one of the things she told me is, do not use fear to motivate people to take action. Fear is counterproductive. It makes us feel paralyzed. You've heard of the fight, flight, or freeze response. Freeze is that paralysis. We shut down. And it also makes our thinking much more rigid, much more black and white. It does not help us think in the kind of expansive, creative ways that we need to think about. So when we're talking to people, we want to inspire them to join me in this action that we're going to take together. Don't scare them. Communicate from your heart. Show them a picture of your grandchild or your child that this is why I'm doing this, because of love. Love is far more invitational than fear. And fear, the other really important thing about fear is that fear grows in isolation. When you're alone late at night, that's when we most tend to feel our fears. But when we act with a community, that's when we feel like we have the support. I mean, just being in a crowd that's all doing the same thing together, you feel more powerful. And also you inspire each other with that contagious courage that we spoke about. And we know that when people are acting together, we feel better. We don't feel so alone. So anger is another thing that can motivate people. And I think there's often a generational difference here. Younger people tend to feel more betrayed and they feel more angry. And often we feel bad, like anger is not a good motivation. But if we think about anger as a kind of fuel, there's a lot of energy in anger. And also anger can really make you clear, boom. We can turn our anger into fuel as long as we sort of work with our self-righteousness. And for those of us who are older and we're talking to younger people, it can be incredibly important to acknowledge, yes, I've been benefiting from all the ways that we have an extractive economy for decades, and it's only now I'm taking action. I think that acknowledgement really can be very disarming. And when I commit to to doing something, that is a really important form of repair. So hope, I would propose to you that hope is a choice and not necessarily a noun. In the show, should you choose to hear it, I interview a woman who is really wrestling with this question about whether to have children because of climate change. And she said, by the end, what I decided is I don't have hope. It's really hard for me to have hope, like a noun, but it is possible for me to hope as a verb. And that was really kind of interesting. She said, I am choosing to hope because it empowers me and it means that I'm going to take action. And Rebecca Solnit, if you know her work, she published a really powerful essay in The Guardian. And she gave some specific reasons to choose hope. She said, one thing is pay attention to the good things that are happening. There's so many things. Here's a second thing that we thought would never happen. Like if you think about marriage equality, that gay couples can get married. Most of the gay friends I choose never thought that would happen. And it's happening. And for instance, the entire Britain is moving away from coal entirely. Nobody thought that could happen. Britain used to be so associated with coal. So things that seem impossible can happen and do, and strengthen yourself by learning what they are. Maybe at the end of I'll put a link into that Rebecca Solnit article so you can click on it and have it to read. It's worth it. Even things that have only indirect consequences, some of the work on the Keystone XL pipeline, all those protests that happened a few years ago, led to extraordinary things, real empowerment among Native children who were part of those powwows. The US Army, 400 people came and got down on their knees and apologized for their role in the decimation of Native tribes. I mean, these are things that happened sort of indirectly along with trying to block the pipeline. So when we're trying to work for good, all kinds of other really hopeful things can happen as well. The other thing is that the solutions already exist. Already, the cost of solar power and wind power has become really affordable, cheaper than other forms of power. So we don't have, I mean, there's all, my son just today had a lecture in his high school about nuclear fusion and how incredible that's going to be as a source of power. But that's probably a long way off. We actually already have the solutions. What we need is the political will to enact them. And then lastly, what helps us stay choosing hope is by nourishing ourselves with beauty, with awe, and with the connection to nature and places that we really love. A crisis of faith in humanity. You're going to hear a story about this from the show in a moment. But one of the things I would say is we need, again, to choose to imagine a future where this can happen. If we imagine that, yes, we as the human race can show up and deal with this, it will help us. What we imagine is true, we can help make become true. If we can't even imagine it, it's very hard to work for it. And again, even just imagining something and working by that vision helps bring things together. So I'd like to talk for a moment here about grief. Many people that I work with, I'm a psychiatrist, who've suffered from depression, may feel afraid to feel grief. They may feel afraid that grief is sort of like depression. And I'd like to make a distinction for you. I think of depression as kind of a pit that you sort of sink into and it feels lifeless in there. It feels awful and you're not even sure you'll ever get out. But grief is much more like a river. I live very near the Saco River. And when I was a girl, we used to go swim in the Saco River. And it's this, as you know, it's this deep, great river for swimming. And I think of grief as like the Saco River. And what I mean by that is you can wade out into the river and feel the tug of the current as we feel the tug of our grief. And we can trust that if we pick our feet up, that our grief, just like the river, will carry us. We can float and feel it tremendously painfully. But when we're done, the current will have carried us to a new place. When we swim out to shore, we will be in a new place. And I would propose to you that grief is like that. Grief is an agent of transformation. It carries us to a very new place. And grief is, of course, rooted in love. What do we grieve? We grieve what we've lost that we loved. So grief is so connected to love. And it will carry you somewhere new. We do not need to be afraid of our grief. So I'd like to introduce you to Chris Childs, who is one of my all-time heroes. He's continuing to do good work. He is the child of some very dear friends of mine. And I'm going to play you a clip from the show in a minute, but I want to just set it up for you. So Chris had heard about climate change. His parents didn't know this about it yet. And he came home from school and was just devastated. He had enormous courage to let himself feel the depth of his feelings about it. And when his parents found out that that was what it was about, they reached out to his teacher. And together with Chris's input, they created a research project for him and his friends to start interviewing people throughout his school on what the school was already doing to fight climate change. And then he and his entire class put together a whole presentation to the whole school, asking them to get involved in combating climate change. And so I'm going to play you the clip. And what I want to invite you to notice is the profound change in his voice. The first part of what you're going to hear is when he's talking about his grief and his fear. And then at the end of the clip, you're going to hear him leading his whole class in this all-school assembly about what we can do about climate change. And his voice is just so strong and so clear. And it's such a wonderful example of the kind of courage that you can find when you act together with others. In his case, when he acted with his whole class. So here he is with some of his friends from his class. And let me just turn my volume up so you can really hear this. Okay, here we go.
One day after school, 9-year-old Chris Childs came home, lay down on the couch, and cried. His mother, Hillary, had no idea why he was upset. She was terrified.
He was so clearly in his own world of grief. This little pale face streaked with tears, and his whole body shaking with these inconsolable sobs. So, of course, I immediately went over to him. It was crying like I had never heard in either of my kids ever. I started guessing what was upsetting him, but I couldn't get to what it was really about, and he couldn't bring himself to name it. We finally realized it had come out of a class discussion on climate change.
Here's how Chris remembers that experience.
I just felt like scared.
Yeah, what was it that scared you?
I don't really know. Like, probably like that people are like making the world worse.
Eventually, Chris's entire 4th grade class gave a presentation to the school about how to fight climate change. Chris, who until now hated public speaking, led the presentation.
Back in September, there was a day when students all over the world walked out of school to bring attention to climate change. People in my class were talking about the strike and what could happen to the earth if we didn't start protecting it better. Some of the things they said really scared me. We hope you will help our class take action against climate change.
Chris let himself feel his grief, and then he plunged into finding out more with others. And it had a ripple effect. The other kids in his class started feeling better too.
It made me kind of happy when we started this project. We're trying to make a difference in climate change, and that made me very happy.
So if you take away one thing from this talk tonight, it's the difference from feeling alone with overwhelming feelings to moving through courage to a place where you're acting together with others to do something that you deeply care about and believe in. And that change in Chris's voice from the beginning, where he talks about like, I was afraid that people were making the world worse, to at the end where he's sort of asking everyone to join his class, that is available to all of us as we work together with people we care about to really address something we love. It's profoundly good for our mental health as much as it is great for the climate. So I love this, as you've noticed with my N-courage, I like hyphens in words that begin with E. So emotions, the word motion is right there hiding within the word emotion, and we almost never notice it. Feelings are about movement. Feelings have enormous energy to get us moving. If we can trust the feelings that we have about climate, we will feel more energized, more alive, and more inclined to do something. So I'm going to ask Sophie to take a poll right now. There's going to be a poll that comes up on your screen. And I would like to invite you to tick off. It's anonymous. Nobody is tracking what you fill out. Fill out it. Click on as many as are true for you about the feelings that come up for you when you think about actually doing something, getting involved, do something about climate change. And scroll down because there's more at the bottom. So there's more than one page, or just scroll so you see all of it. Just click on any one, as many as feel true for you. Okay, thank you for doing that. So I know you're going to continue. It's changing and changing, but I want to just look at this together. Let's learn live together. So if we look at what seem to be the highest ones, fearful about the future is very high. And confusion over how to be effective. Those seem to be the two highest, closely followed by grief over losses and extinctions. So I find that incredibly consistent. This is what I notice happening when I give talks elsewhere. Fear about the future and real confusion over how to be effective. So I'm hoping that I'm going to end the poll now. Thank you so much for doing that. It's really valuable to see that. So that just gives, so I hope that for the things that you ticked off, though, you don't feel alone, because did you notice not a single one of them didn't have any response? All of us are feeling at least one or two or three of those things. So the forces of avoidance, where we're going now is step 3, which is about moving into action and doing something. And there are many things that get in the way of that. The hopelessness we talked about, the uncertainty over how to be effective, that was one of the 2 highest things. The sense that powerful interests are going to prevail. They've been organizing around this for a long time. Just even hearing that it was British Petroleum that invented the carbon footprint is so sobering about how strategic and the forces that are invested in this are. Our lives are overwhelmingly busy. Their hope that someone else, who knows more about this will take care of it for me. Something called the bystander effect. The more people that are witnessing something bad happening, like say bullying in a crowd, the more people who are witnessing it who are doing nothing, the more people there are, the less likely people are to take action. So there's a whole population of us, in the planet, many of us who aren't doing anything, and it contributes to doing less. The good thing about the bystander effect is if one person steps out from that crowd and says, stop, this is not okay, stop it, more people will tend to join with that person. So this is, again, one of the powers of individual action, especially when it's visible. You can have an effect on a large crowd. And this is that a sense of being insignificant. I'm only one person. How can I really make a difference? These are the kinds of things that I hear from friends and from my patients about why it feels impossible to actually take a step. So I am going to propose to you that the way to help you, figure out what step to take is to do it with others, to do it in a community, to not do it alone. A community of people that's active with you, they inspire you, they make it fun because you've got friends there. They help you keep accountable. If you say you were going to do it, they'll check in with you next week. Did you do it? And also because there's so many different skills there that you can rely on each other. Often we learn from each other in a community, and a community can make us determined. I'm going to share a story with you about this in a minute. But also communities are more effective at bringing change than individuals are. So if I think about sustainable climate action, it isn't only that we're looking for sustainability, it's that our action has to be sustainable. And I would propose to you that in order so that we don't burn out on it, in order for it to be sustainable, it needs to feel life-giving. It needs to be doing something that I love. It needs to be using my gifts, your gifts, things that you feel good at, so that you feel joy, and also with people that you care about. So you don't only have joy when you have a victory, but you have joy from being together. So the end of the show, there's a story, and many of you here in Maine may know this story. This is the story of Protect South Portland that was effective in blocking the pipeline from the tar sands in Alberta, Canada, from reversing its flow and sending that really dirty oil down to South Portland, where ships, tankers would then take it out, to the rest of the world who was going to buy it. So Rachel Berger is an 82-year-old woman here in South Portland who knew that she was prepared to do a lot to stop this. She wasn't a scientist. She was 82. She wasn't working. She felt a little rusty on a few things. So what she did, she went to her town council. She went to her town meeting and she said, I'm going to host a potluck supper at my house once a week to talk about what we're going to do to stop this pipeline. Anyone who wants to help me is invited. That's what she did. She didn't have to be an expert. She didn't have to be a scientist. She didn't have to be a lobbyist. She didn't have to be wealthy. It was a potluck supper. She didn't even have to provide all the food. So she started having a weekly dinner at her house. And you probably know the story. Eventually they were able to pass an ordinance that blocked the pipeline from being reversed and discharging their oil there at the harbor. And she talks about, and what I'd like to do, I'm going to play you just a clip from it. I'd like to invite you to listen to, again, not just their effectiveness at blocking international work. I mean, they were incredibly powerful, started at a potluck supper, don't forget, but also hear the joy in their voices in terms of, mental health component. So this is Rachel Berger.
I saw this in my own state when a pipeline corporation announced plans to build a terminal in South Portland to pipe oil from the tar sands in Alberta, Canada, down to southern Maine for export. Tar sands oil requires the most toxic form of chemical refining and is already poisoning ecosystems in Alberta.
In South Portland this morning, there is a push to protect the city from tar sands oil.
Many people fear that if a pipeline carrying the oil to Maine ruptures, it could cause an environmental catastrophe.
That's right, and as a result,
When 82-year-old Rachel Berger learned about the terminal plans, she wanted to do something to stop them. She didn't have a strategy, but she started a group that met weekly at her house to figure out how to fight the pipeline company together.
One of the things I learned way back was, even if you don't know what you're going to do, show up, be there. One of the people in the group wanted to write an ordinance, and we were told from the city that we had to have 900 signatures to be able to put it on the ballot. This was all for me, a new learning thing. So we needed people to do door to door to collect those signatures. In that process, we got close to 4,000 signatures when all we needed was 900. That was the energy that was going into this. Lots of people said, I just love that we can finally do something together. And I think they felt the strength of that.
But as the movement started to gain traction, the pipeline company caught on. They started a disinformation campaign, and the ordinance lost by 193 votes. The group didn't give up. They wrote a new, clearer ordinance, and they testified in front of South Portland City Council.
One meeting after another, more and more people would come.
We must think of our future children, children's children.
And for the people who feel that the money from the oil and jobs are more important, you don't have jobs on a dead planet.
This is not just a South Portland issue, but an international issue.
We object. We most passionately object. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Eventually, there was a final vote, and this time, the ordinance passed.
Everybody was massively happy, hysterically happy. So we've just got this one little city. We've got this one little city we need to look after. But what's exciting about it is other cities are taking, when we've got a model ordinance, Portland is taking it, and then Falmouth will, and Yarmouth will, and so on. People are looking to us that way, and people are talking about South Portland like it's a place where stuff is happening.
What was it like for you to feel like you had really helped make this happen?
It made me realize how a group of people, in this case it became a large group, how powerful they are. And I still underestimate that. And it's something we all have to acknowledge and really take in. How powerful ordinary people can be working together to do the right thing. We tend to think that all the people with the money are so powerful and we can't change anything. But we can change things. And we just have to follow what we know is right. My goal is basically to stop all the stuff that's going on that's wrong. My determination is to do it until the end of my life, for all I can do.
I love that story so much. She is so inspiring because most of us could host a potluck supper at their house once a week if push came to shove. And it's extraordinary to think that that was the beginning of such an effective action. So that show, I want to just invite you. This is the show itself. If you want to listen to it, safespaceradio.com, Climate Courage. It addresses these three movements. But what I want to do now, just so you know, because I think I can't see the clock when I'm, I don't know what time it is, but I think we probably have about a half hour left. Is that right? Could someone signal to me what time it is? Yeah, about that. Okay, 25 minutes left, maybe something like that. Okay, so we are going to go into breakout rooms for about 12 minutes, and then we're going to have questions and answers and responses at the end. So please don't leave because we really I think this will be very valuable. We're going to, Sophie, who's our tech guru, is going to divide you up into twosomes, and you're going to ask 4 questions of each other. So you're each going to get 6 minutes to go. So what touches your heart about climate change? In other words, what do you love that motivates you? What skills do you bring? Do you have legislative skills, financial skills, educational, fundraising, outreach, research, organizing, communications? I should have put potluck hosting here. I don't know why I didn't put that. Thirdly, what aspect interests you the most? For this to be sustainable, you want to be interested. So are you interested in learning about renewable energy and power? Are you interested in learning about what banks are funding the oil companies? You interested in education about this in schools? Looking at how we transform the transportation industry, looking at how we change our agricultural system because they're huge emitters of methane gas, looking about how we stop extracting fossil fuels, how to become more energy efficient. There's so many ways to make a meaningful contribution. So as I say these things, I hope you're already thinking like, I'm interested in that. And then lastly, what is one step you could take in the next 2 weeks? And I'm going to invite you to say it to each other, because what we know about accountability is that when you commit to something to one other person, even if you're paired with someone you will never see again, and you probably will be, you might be, there's something about having said you're going to do something. I remember in the chat, someone listed that as one of their sources of encouragement. I said I would do it, so then I had to do it. So because these 4 questions are a little bit involved, when you're going to get put in your breakout room, you're not going to see these questions because we wanted you to be able to see each other. So just jot this down if you want on your piece of paper. What do you love that motivates you? What are the skills you bring to the table? What is the aspect of it that you want to focus on? And what is one step you want to take? And by step, let me just make this really accessible. It could mean I'm going to go read about the Maine Climate Action Plan. It could mean I'll look into the Citizens Climate Lobby or the Sierra Club or 350.org. Those are some of the organizations that have chapters here in Maine that are national. I'll say those again more slowly. Sierra Club, 350.org, Citizens Climate Action Lobby, or Citizens Climate Lobby, I think it is. Those are some of the organizations you could look up because they have local chapters, and that would be a step, just reaching out to them and finding out what they're doing. That's the first step. So I am going to turn it over to you, Sophie, now, if you would please break us up into breakout rooms. And if you could time it for 6 minutes and then they get a notification and then a second 6 minutes. So they change turns at 6 minutes. So we'll be gone for 12 minutes and then we'll come back for Q&A. Thank you. So welcome back. So nice to see your faces. And is everyone back now? Yes, it's so lovely after the breakout rooms. I actually get to see your faces now. As a speaker, I have to say it is a joy to see you. And I'm going to put us on gallery view. So this is the part of the question and answer. And I have asked Sophie to unmute. You can now officially unmute yourself. If you have a question you would like to ask, please raise your hand. It looks like Kimberly Simmons. Oh, okay. You're putting it in the chat. You're sharing a resource with us. Thank you. And you don't only have to have a question. You could have a response or a comment. I'm really open to any of the above. Is there anyone who would like to go?
I'll go. Anne, hi. Kim Simmons. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about how, going back to the piece about inspiring, love and connection and not scaring each other. And at the same time, especially in a classroom, but in other groups too, that sharing of fear is authentic. And so I'm just wondering if you can say anything about sort of how you handle it when people are disclosing their big fears to you, and also any tips for as groups, how we kind of create a little bit of boundary, or I don't even know exactly what, to make it so that we can share our real feelings without over putting that on other people.
That's such a great question, right? Because you don't want people to be alone with their fear. So you want them to be able to give voice to it. But you also don't want them to do it in a way that terrifies every single other person in the room, so they all go home freaked out. I think that confessions of our deepest, darkest fears tend to be one-on-one generally. Now, usually that's the case. And I think that's the best way to share a really, really intense personal fear, is to do it with one trusted other. When we share really deep fears with a crowd where we don't even know people, you can often get what we call a vulnerability hangover, where the next day you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. I don't even know those people. So sometimes I invite people to take care of themselves and to choose the person that they most want to share their fear with. And then to speak about it more in generic terms, like, all of us are afraid. The future is frightening. And when we say it like that, there's something sort of calming and comforting in acknowledging we're all in this together. There's so much uncertainty. It really is frightening. And our fears are valid, but we don't have to give them the power. What we really can do is like decide together what we're going to do. And when we move our energy into like the sense of our community, our togetherness, and the sense of like, what are we going to do together? It really takes some of the power out. Sometimes just having a plan is so helpful. That's why in your breakout rooms, I invited you to each commit to like, what is the thing I'm going to do? Because when you have a plan, already you feel better. Does that address your question, Kim?
Yeah, I think like almost that sense of like helping to create that scaffolding, just bringing the meta, because for me, it comes up as a teacher, but I'm sure other people in other kinds of groups as well. So setting those like a little bit of reminding people some of what you just said, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Thank you. And I know someone else was trying to ask a question too. I didn't see who you were, but I invite you to unmute yourself and ask it. Or just respond.
Hi, Ann. I just wanted to say that I think one of the things is how we get into conversation with people about climate change when we don't know that they're active, they're pro, addressing it, or they feel maybe the guilt that you talked about. And so I think one of the things I've learned is asking real questions and allowing people to talk about their experience with it and what it might mean for them and where they don't want to go, really being aware. So we're sensitive to that, because I think that particularly if we're going to do community work and try and engage people in a positive way, we have to really be sensitive. We don't become, we use the word lobbyist because I was one, but use a salesman approach to it, which comes from our position and not what their experience is. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on that. But.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that's right. If you come across too strident, it sort of turns people off. As part of what I was saying too about the self-righteousness and how self-defeating that can be. I think if we acknowledge what I've learned, since my favorite thing is like difficult subjects, what I've learned is that if we start out by saying, this can be hard to talk about, but I'm really curious, where are you with climate change? How are you feeling about it? That is very disarming, and it really invites the conversation to be led from a very heartfelt place. And when we say, this is difficult, it gives people permission to be in different places. And also just that cultivation of curiosity, like I'm genuinely curious to hear, how are you feeling? Curiosity is also very inviting. And that's the way I would propose that we begin these conversations. Thank you, Janice. Anyone
Hi,
else?
Ann. Yeah, I had just a quick comment. Thanks for your presentation today. It was really great and insightful to kind of hear the emotional side of climate change. Yeah, I'm someone who works in climate finance, and we don't spend much time thinking about sort of how we feel about it. I think generally it's sort of low-grade anxiety all of the time. However, I would kind of like to bring this up to you for discussion and with the group. Your point about BP creating carbon accounting, I believe it's somewhat of a red herring in our whole discussion around climate. Yes, it is correct that BP pushed really hard on carbon accounting decades ago to shift the onus from government to individuals. In the time that has passed since, lots of work has been done around carbon accounting to try to create mechanisms for us to address climate. And so bringing up BP and focusing that they are the ones who move responsibility to individuals, I would say that's very similar to conservative pundits' comments around the Green New Deal, that all that we're going to do is measure cow farts. Carbon accounting underpins everything with climate. It does, however, can be misused as it has been by corporations and by governments. And I think if we're going to address climate, it's individuals, it's corporations, and it's government. We've all got to be working on this together. And I think that the core basis underpinning everything around climate change is, what are our emissions and what can we do to reduce them? And I think if we lose sight of that, we really expose ourselves to a lot of potential for greenwashing, where we feel like we're doing something to affect climate change, but nothing's actually happening. And so I think that that's our big risk with all of this, that, you know, to a receptive audience like this, I would love to, you know, stay engaged with the underlying math and the science, because that is actually how we're going to address this problem. So thanks.
No, thank you so much. And I feel like I like what you're saying, and I would just add to it in the sense that for me, it's not just about carbon accounting, but it's also about keeping it in the ground.
Yeah,
You know,
definitely.
so that, you know, because we all have a limited amount of energy, right? I don't know anyone who doesn't feel like they're too busy. I literally don't know a single person who doesn't feel too busy. And so if we only have a certain amount of time to give to this cause, for me, it's, you know, I would rather, and this may just be for me and Hallward, you know, when we talked about what are your gifts and where are you interested? For me, it's, I think, around, you know, speaking of financing, and you know more about this, I defer to you on that, but, you know, stopping the group Third Act, if some of you know about them, they have a big campaign now to ask consumers in the 4 big banks like Chase Bank and Bank of America, who are funding some of the new extraction, the new oil drilling, you know, the new refineries, they make the loans to those companies to try to ask them to stop. Because to me, it's not just about, you know, are our buildings insulated enough that we reduce our emissions, but it really is, can we please stop mining any new coal, any new oil, any new gas?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I guess I'll give a quick plug to an app that does a great job that I've done some work with in the past. I'll shoot it in the message board, but it's called Geeky Zero. They're out of London. And so you can go in there, you answer some really easy questions about your lifestyle, and it'll actually give you actionable steps, kind of in a non-threatening, non-intimidating way, about how you could change your diet, your driving habits, your travel habits, and you can actually see that impact. Yes, I 100% agree with you. We need to keep things in the ground and be skeptical. However, if we can keep things in the ground somewhere, another person's going to drill in another place. So I think we have to stay engaged with it and accept our reality here on Earth. Is that the economy runs on oil, and unfortunately we're going to have to find a way off of it, and it's going to take time. So that's my plug.
Yes, no, I agree with you completely. I think we're on the same side, and I think the more we pressure companies and our governments to accelerate that transition, the better. And we need to be doing it. We can't only be working on individual action and an individual behavior. It's got to be bigger. It's got to be both and.
Yep.
So, and I noticed, by the way, I just want to invite many of you to look at the chat, because people are sharing some fantastic resources. I just want to draw your attention to them, that someone was saying the Citizens Climate Lobby in Portland has a meeting this Saturday at 9 a.m. on Zoom. And if you look down, you can see some of these links. People are sharing wonderful resources. And I know we're at 8:31 and we're supposed to shut at 8:30, but I want to give you time to look at those resources and to just check, is there anyone else who has something that you really want to say before we stop, because I want to make sure you get to feel heard or be heard.
Yes, I would like to say something.
Yeah, you
Okay.
have.
I can't see, which one are you?
This is, I'm sitting with Janice.
Okay, yes, hi, yes,
Hello, group.
hi.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that great presentation. I wanted to say something specifically about the last thing that August Jepson said. I think that individual actions are extremely important. I agree with you. But I think there are many other moving parts in this reality. I think you mentioned government, but there's also industry and there's countries. And the issue as I see it is that I'm struck by the fact that all of us here, I think I saw 71% are concerned about climate change. And the question is, you said we have to accept the reality that we have fossil fuels. I would say we have to accept the reality that we don't have a lot of time left with the accelerating pace of climate change. And the group that I'm in, and I see one of my colleagues here tonight, David Kuhnhart, is also in. It's not that individual actions don't matter. They do matter. You're absolutely right. But I can't say it in a clever way, the clock is ticking. We don't have a lot of time. And the whole idea is that the faster we can switch to renewable energy, the better. And Anne is absolutely right. You can't do it with an attitude of condescension or with being superior. But I just know from my time in the group I'm in, Citizens Climate Lobby, it's very empowering to be with a lot of other people who are concerned, willing to write letters, willing to lobby, willing to do lots of actions. And I would encourage you, whether it's the group I'm in or other groups, to get involved, because I think you can see by just what's happened in the last hour and a half, it's you're not as alone as you think.
Thank you so much, Walt. I appreciate that. I know that we're at time and I want to honor our commitment to that. So I want to just close with one closing slide, which is, so to be with, listen with curiosity to, and share the grief and fear and pain with people that you love, that you're close to. Don't be afraid of your feelings. They have a lot of energy to move you into action. Connect with your love for the planet, for your kids, for animals, for the refugees and people who will probably suffer the most, which is in many ways the people of the global South. Seek clarity about how you will act. What are you good at? What do you enjoy? Where do you want to make a contribution? I really hope you will each take that step that you committed to in your small group. And then lastly, seek or create community. Don't be alone with this. And my favorite, this might seem a little hokey, but if you'll humor me, I love this. Notice that the movement from ill to well is the movement from I to we. Is that not cool? I don't know, maybe you all have noticed that before, but I hadn't noticed that before. And I think it's that simple. We need to be in community to help us with our mental health concerns. And we need to be in community in order to be effective and powerful enough to make the kind of changes that need to happen urgently. So that is where I will end. I want to thank Sophie and Lucy and Kelly from the Cumberland, Scarborough, and York libraries for hosting this event. And for people who want to follow up, I think each of the libraries are doing various talks about sustainability. Go to your local library, whether that's York, Cumberland, or Scarborough, or even if it's not your local. I happen to know that Sophie, Kelly, and Lucy are awesome librarians and will help you find this. So we know it's being saved. You know that your library is your fantastic local resource. And I invite you to go to your library more often anyway, for so many good reasons. But this is where you'll find it. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your kind comments in the chat. I appreciate them. And the recording, I guess we'll turn to our libraries to find it. Okay. Be well and take your one step you committed to. You can do this.